Your moment will never come at the perfect time or under the perfect circumstances, but you have a perfect God. So what if we thought about our what ifs a little differently? What if our what ifs could be all about our faith? What if instead of our what ifs being about our concerns, what if they could be about our confidence? What if instead of those being our doubt, what if we could make those what ifs our trust? What if we flipped the script on this thing a little bit? That every time I say, what if I mess up, instead I said, what if God shows up? What if instead of saying, what if I don't have what it takes? What if I say, what if God's using this as a setup in the midst of this setback? When I say, what if it's too late? What if instead I say, what if God's doing this just in time? In those moments when I say, what if I'm scared? Instead, what if I said, what if God is doing something wonderful in the midst of this? And I know I can trust Him to nurture me and protect me right in the middle of the place where I am. What if we changed our language about the what ifs? What if instead of it being filling us with fear, we allowed it to fill us with trust? What if we asked God to do something big in our life? What if we would shift this in this moment, in this window of time, and allow our what ifs to be something that causes us to trust Him more than ever? Well, hey, thanks for joining us on this special teaching that we do on Tuesdays. And if you know folks who haven't yet jumped in to join us on these Tuesdays, these have been really special and just kind of neat times. And it's fun because we get to go a little bit deeper on what we talked about on Sunday. And also, I think it's kind of a unique perspective because sometimes you get an opportunity to see some of our staff that you wouldn't normally see on a Sunday because they work on Sundays. And so that's kind of how it is. So one of those is Pastor Matthew Ford.
Yep.
Pastor Matt, good to see you.
Yeah.
What do you do on Sundays?
You know, I just walk around, smile at people.
Yeah.
No, we do our high school ministry on Sundays, so we do a group-oriented style. And what I love about it is it's an opportunity for students to be able to connect with each other, talk about God's Word, which has been really cool. And just make relationships. That's one thing you can't get online.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I guess you can technically get a relationship online, but there's something about in-person relationships that students have been craving. Yeah. So it's been really fun.
And it's been neat to see how, during this season where you haven't always been able to do youth ministry, which was very event and kind of high impact driven, some of that hasn't necessarily been as possible the last year, how you guys have really pivoted, and that's the word overused word you're supposed to.
I don't have the cool words anymore, so I'm almost over that.
You pivoted in unprecedented times. I think I covered it all right there. But thanks for doing that and impacting our students. And we're coming. If you're not watching this kind of live, we're coming at this the week after Easter. So we just had our Easter services. Most attendance that we've had in the building since March of 2020. And so it was fun. It was just such a cool day and good to see people from out of town, good to see people who are kind of in a season where they're comfortable and ready to come back to church. And our worship team just, both in Auditorium 1 and the services in Auditorium 2, just hit it out of the park. And what a really, really cool weekend. And so thankful for so many of our kind of volunteers who served in kids ministry, hospitality, worship, tech, so many different places. So thanks for an awesome weekend. Good Friday services, of course, always really special. And so if you weren't with us or haven't had a chance to watch online yet, I really kind of broke the mold. I thought incredibly creative, and I preached on the resurrection of Jesus Christ this Easter. And that's it, man. You gotta do it. And it's one of those things where every year, I've been honored to be in that spot. 2005 would have been the first Easter that I had the chance to preach at Calvary, and it's the same story every year. In fact, I think I can say this to if you're watching online, it's safe to say, like, for some people that only come at Easter, they think I only preach on one story, right? I mean, how hard can it be? The guy just has to know one story, But you get a different perspective, and I am so sometimes I think we get frustrated, or sometimes people will let it, I think, cause a rift between them and God, that we have 4 Gospels, and each has a different perspective. But those places aren't contradictions. I think they're more complementary of each other. And if you look at something from a different angle, that's been part of what's been unique about masks and seeing people out in public that have to wear them in a grocery store or whatever. And you look and you're like, I'm not sure if that's them or not, because you're seeing them from a different angle. And I've embarrassed myself saying hello to some people who I thought they were and they weren't, and now I'm just a creeper. And so that's like, I think the Gospels give us that. And
They
so
very much do.
this year we took a look at Mary Magdalene and that perspective. We walked through 6 things that we called empty tomb truths, and just really how transformational, and I think that's where we'll go in these next few moments, just an experience of the resurrected Christ, how transformational that is. And so we looked at these 6 things. The 6th one maybe is the place where we'll land today, where we talked about, and this was empty tomb truth number 6, that you are called by name. It's really interesting. After Mary has this whole encounter at the tomb, when she finally is face to face with Jesus and gets a little pushy, right? Because she thinks he's the gardener. That part of the story just cracks me up. She's like, "Where'd you put the body? Get out of my way. I'll go get it." He just looks at her and says her name. He doesn't try to explain what happened. He doesn't try to, cover his tracks or, make her understand some deep spiritual truth. He just says her name. And in that moment, something so powerful happens. John chapter 20, verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And you got to think too, like him saying her name, if you're not familiar with the story of Mary Magdalene, she at one point had been basically demon possessed from what we see in Scripture. And Jesus cast those 7 demons out of her. 7 just represents the extremity of it. Like if 1 wasn't bad enough, 7's worse. And you think, like, what was she called in her life? Like all the different names that people called her, and probably her name Mary, even in her hometown and community to other people. Was she Scary Mary? Was she, Mad Mary, Demon Mary? Like, what was she? To have his lips say her name, how powerful was that? And, I think the resurrection wasn't just some theological event for the church, which it was, right? And we can tend to sometimes doctor it all up into a textbook and make it a theological turning point, or make it a holiday, or we call it the greatest day in history. All that's true, but it's so much more than that. And I know that's part of what you were kind of sharing when you look not just at that one encounter with Mary, but maybe the larger biblical picture of the resurrection.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like it's so easy to get like caught up in connecting all the dots in the Bible and how the resurrection is fulfilling all this stuff and how important it is. And that's all, like you said, that's all true. Without the resurrection, we'd have a problem. We would have a real problem, right, with our faith. But the real moment in that story, like you brought out, and I think that 6th point, empty tomb truth was that's hard to say. I don't know how you said that so often.
You know what? Half the services I said it was an empty truth tomb, and it's like that's not. There was not an empty truth, And so,
it is that individual impact, that mattered so much to people, and we see that kind of over and over again after the resurrection, and I think that's what we need to get from the story today is that we need to have an encounter. An individual encounter with the risen Christ. That's what's going to make a total difference in our lives. It's not that I know it happened. I can know a lot of things have happened. For instance, if there's a hurricane halfway around the world, I can know that it happened. I can believe that it happened. But it really doesn't impact me.
Well, that's a really good,
But if I'm in the hurricane, now it impacts me personally. And I think that resurrection needs to be an individual thing, that we encounter the risen Christ personally. And I think John's account that you really used as your scriptures for your sermon this week, in particular, focuses on that individual impact that Jesus had after the resurrection. The very first person he talked to was Mary Magdalene. Mary was an insignificant person in a lot of ways to that culture, like you brought out. And probably if you were going to say, what's the most impactful person I could tell that I know everyone will believe, It would not. She would have been at the bottom of the list. It's like the lowest ranked team in the NCAA getting almost to the finals. It's those kind of moments. But yet she was the one that he picked to tell and have that encounter, and it totally transformed her. When he said her name, she went from being this fearful, worried, uncertain person, wondering what's next, to now I've got to go tell somebody. Now I've seen the risen Christ. And her devotion was what put her in the right place at the right time for that, right? We'll talk, I think, some more about that. Jesus, then, I would have went to probably the biggest collection of people to make sure that I announced it to the most people all at once so they could see me and everyone would believe, right? But Jesus went to one, and then he went to the 11 disciples that were still around, right? We lost one during all of this, right? So he went to the 11. I like to think that he went back to his life group, right? He went back to his life group and told them, I told you guys, I told you guys that this would happen, and here I am. He went to his closest friends. And then later, not really just about a week later, right? Thomas didn't happen to be there. So I guess really there was 10 people there. And Thomas didn't happen to be there. And Jesus took the moment when Thomas was there to individually encounter him. He didn't rely on the other 10 to say, look, we all saw him. It's real. You need to believe it, Thomas. He went directly to Thomas. And, you can read that story. We don't have to read the scripture here, but in the verses 26 through 28 of John chapter 20, Jesus appears to the 11 with Thomas there, and Thomas's response after that encounter with Jesus was, "My Lord and my God." It transformed his life right there. That resurrection needed to be personal for Thomas, and Jesus made sure that it was. It wasn't just enough for Thomas to hear it from somebody else. Thomas needed to see it, and Jesus made sure that happened. And it made all the difference in the world to Thomas. And so something significant always happens when you see Jesus appear, this risen Jesus appear. Something really significant. You think about this group of people who scattered when Jesus was arrested. He scattered, and they all scattered. They were afraid that they were next, or that they were coming for them, right? When Jesus even appeared the first time, they were afraid. They were fearful behind locked doors, and Jesus, just kind of goes through that. So they went from this grief-filled, fear-filled group of people that followed a failed leader that had been executed, thinking that they're next, to now they're bold, and they're going to put their own lives on the line. So something happened, right? It was this experience, this individual experience with the risen Christ that made all the difference. And you even see it further in the New Testament, like Paul, the Apostle Paul, he always called himself a little bit of a latecomer, right? He said it was like one born out of sequence or whatever, right? He was just a little bit behind the times, but he was contemporary there. He lived in that same time frame. And Paul was, a Jewish, up and coming kind of guy. He was going to be in the leadership. He already was getting leadership roles. And on his way to Damascus, he was chasing down Christians. He's like, these guys are terrible. I'm going to get rid of them. And on his way to Damascus, who appears to him but the risen Jesus, right? The risen, resurrected Jesus, which totally transformed his life. Paul knew there was a crucified Jesus. He was aware of that. He knew that happened. And he was chasing down these people because he didn't believe there was a resurrected Jesus. He heard the stories, but he didn't believe that. But he encountered the resurrected Jesus, and that changed his life. He went from the persecutor to the biggest ambassador for Christ in that moment. And it made all the difference. His writings after that, he stresses how important the resurrection is. And then he does get into some theology about the resurrection. But he holds the resurrection central to our faith, right? But that encounter with the resurrected Jesus made all the difference to all these people. And that's what I think we need today. We need, as 21st century Christians, we need an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Maybe not face to face like they did, but we need that encounter.
That's often been one of the apologetic arguments that I've heard for how we can maybe hold on to the validity of the resurrection, was because the witnesses to it died as martyrs. And the concept being you won't die for a lie, and how they were all willing to die for something that they really believed. If it was a conspiracy, somewhere someone would have blabbed, because you've got 10 of the 12 apostles who are going to be martyred, and John, who's going to be tortured, and then you've got the string of followers who are unnamed, and so that resurrection transformational experience is huge. But if we get to reality, we more likely than not are not going to have mass sightings of a physical presence of Jesus until the end of times, whether it's the rapture, the second coming, or however you want to phrase that. And so that principle, that it's going to be a real personal encounter. What's it mean for us in the 21st century? Like how do we play that out? So I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. I think you look at these people that we see that impact with, and I think first of all, they had their lives focused on Jesus or focused on God. And I don't mean like every waking moment all you do is do nothing else but meditate on God. I don't think that was what they were doing. I think a lot of them were going about their own lives. Certainly Paul was going about his own life, right? He was on a mission at that moment. Mary's focus was Jesus. She was devoted to him. And so her focus was there. So as she went about her day, she was focused on how she could best serve him and how she could best be in a position to help him. And that put her, I think, in that position so Jesus would be there for her, that he would appear to her first. I think even like he was misguided in his devotion in a way, right? He was certainly at that moment going to Damascus, he wasn't devoted to Jesus. In fact, he was totally against Jesus, really. But in his heart, I think he was devoted to God. And God noticed that. And even though he was misguided, and I know I've been misguided a lot in my life, and God's happened to use things like that in my life, he used that misguided devotion that Paul had and let that be the moment where Jesus encountered him on the road to Damascus that totally transformed him. I think about like the 11 disciples. They spent 3+ years with Jesus. They left some of their occupations behind and chose to walk with Jesus for 3.5 years. And so even though they didn't understand what was going on, they were lost half the time, they would say dumb stuff, which sounds, again, like me a lot. Their heart was right. And so God used that, and Jesus appeared to them because their heart was right there, and they were seeking that encounter with God.
Do you think that factors into, sometimes you'll hear, especially as you're talking about Paul, sometimes you'll hear people ask the question, why do we see more miracles or supernatural things happening, say in, do you say underdeveloped parts of the world or places, you don't necessarily see that as much, say in Western Europe or in a North American context that you might see in the global South, in a Christian realm, where you hear about more miracles or that kind of thing. And do you think in part because there is at least an openness there, both to the supernatural in some contexts and to the necessity for a higher power, when in some places culturally we've actually pushed that away? Do you think I'm making that up, or do you think there's something to that?
No, I know what you mean. I think in places like that where they need maybe physically, like they need sustenance, they need provision, they need shelter, whatever it is, there tends to be, it's easier to grasp onto something physical as a desire for need, where I think we're starving in our culture is the spiritual need, but that's a lot harder to identify, a lot easier to push to the side, and what I think is relatable about this story is Jesus met each person at their need, because those first 4 points about the tomb were all about grief and about loss. And it's like in that point, we won't see the resurrected Jesus, but I know in times in people's lives of grief, we talk about this in doing funerals and taking care of families in those moments. Those are the moments when someone calls them by name that they recognize, their pastor, their friend, their parent. When they call them by name, then there's a certain comfort that comes with that, right? And it draws them back into alignment with Christ. Because when you're in grief, you feel lost. You feel like you're adrift and you don't know where to look. And so, when we're thinking about the spiritual need, oftentimes for people who have everything physically, it takes loss, it takes grief to open their eyes up to the spiritual need that they have and the loss that they have. So I think that might play into it a little bit.
Absolutely. I think there's that sense. And then you threw out one other example that we might not think of to illustrate this point, but the thought of, hey, there's something that happens when you focus on Jesus.
Yeah.
And
we talked.
This challenged me when you mentioned it.
We talked a lot about the people that had a focus with God or specifically on Jesus and how that kind of opened the door for this. There's a fellow by the name of Judas Iscariot, right? Most people believe that he was more along the lines of what they used to call a zealot or something like that, who was really interested in overthrowing the Roman occupation, right? So they could get back to their own self-governance, and so you might think of him as a zealot in that way, or maybe maybe a highly political guy of some sort, that kind of a thing, and so his focus was a little bit different, right? It wasn't so much on Jesus, how can we serve you and how can we see your kingdom come? It was, this is what we need you to do, Jesus. And so many think that the whole betrayal thing was an effort to kind of force his hand in a way to do something like that. And that kind of, I think, stems from a focus not on Jesus. It's a good example, if you want to look at it that way, of how we can easily get our eyes off of Jesus and onto something else that we think is more important. And the problem is that in his life, he didn't put himself in a place to see the resurrected Christ. He missed that. All the other disciples who did saw Jesus. He missed it, and that's a real tragedy.
Yeah, and I think to your point, like sometimes we can mistake physical proximity for focus on Jesus. It's like, well, if I go to church or if I do all of these things, the proximity with Jesus
That's a good point.
Is what makes the focus. And it's obvious it's different, because if someone who walked literally with Jesus got his eyes off focus, how easily can we, not being able to physically see Jesus, get our eyes off focus? So that's always something that I'm aware of, is just if I'm in proximity with Jesus, I still have to be careful that my focus of my life is on him,
That's good.
I was just going to say one, along the lines here, I think, you might hear what we're talking about and say, I don't have time to focus on Jesus all the time, right? And I get that, and I think kind of the way I like to think about it is, God's given me a life to live here. He's given me, I worked a long time in the refining business, right? I could find a way to think about Jesus during the day. Jesus could be, for instance, when I interacted with people, I could make the choice to bring Jesus with me in those interactions, so that I would interact like he would interact. That's what I think I mean by focusing on Jesus. It's not that I go off and kind of cloister myself. I actually bring Jesus into the totality of my life, not just the 5-minute devotional time in the morning, but actually I want to walk with him through the entire day and let him kind of guide my interactions.
That's good.
that's not some theoretical thing. That's actually the way we should live, right? And that puts us in a place to see the resurrected Christ in our life.
So first we need to refocus on Jesus. If this is going to apply to us in the 21st century, we start there. What's another thought that we could have?
Yeah, I think the second thing, as we've been talking, is just that personal encounter of the risen Christ. There's a moment where you realize he's just not some dead guy in a book, that your parents told you about. And I see this in the youth world. There's a time, sometime middle school, high school, where it clicks for a kid. And that's our goal as youth pastors, is to say, how can we help this be more than just your parents' faith or more than just this guy in a book, but a personal encounter through worship, through the people, through the reading of God's word, to bring it to life, because you don't walk with someone who's dead, you walk with someone who's alive.
It's really good.
And so that personal encounter makes a difference, and your parents can't do it for you. Your best friend who brought you to church can't do it for you. It's your own encounter with, in some ways, the ideal person, right? Because Christ was the ideal person. And in that ideal, we come in confrontation of how we fall short. I think part of that is that encounter with the real Jesus that says, this is who we say the best human can be. I fall really short of that. And that's my encounter of saying, I fall this short, but he still loves me and walks beside me anyway. And that's what makes our religion different than others, is the idea of walking with God, not at a God or, trying to appease a God, but in the same direction. I believe Jesus appeared to the two men on the road and walked beside them, talked to them and journeyed with them. And so that personal encounter is something that happens with each of us. And I think when you were talking about Thomas, he was hesitant, some would call him a skeptic, but I would say he was hesitant about it. He hadn't seen it for himself. But as soon as he saw it, he became all in. It was for him. It was like, yeah, you told me about this guy. And we probably know people in our life who is like, yeah, you told me about this Jesus or whatever. But then they have that moment where you take them a meal and you pray with them, or you bring them to church, or whatever happens, they have this encounter in worship with. And it makes all the difference. You have all of this objective, but at some point the subjective Lord meet together. And that personal encounter is really important. And like you mentioned about Paul too, it's like he went from the worst of sinners to the greatest of saints, wrote most of the New Testament just in this moment where he met the Lord, and he was blind for 3 days, and, sometimes I wish I could be blind for 3 days and follow Jesus much better, maybe I shouldn't say that, but like if that transformation would happen much quicker, maybe I would take that. I don't know. Check with me later. But it was like, it was almost like Paul didn't have to change his demeanor. It was still all in for something.
Yeah.
It was just the direction, like we're talking about, the direction of his faith, the personal encounter with Christ. And, I think every person has that dramatic change. And that dramatic change takes time. Like we see Paul's story and we think, oh, it happened all in a moment. But if I'm not mistaken, he went away out into the desert for a few years and learned his scripture and met with the Lord before he became the Paul that we know. And so there's some point where we tell people, when you have that change to Christ, there is a point of walking through what feels like a desert. It's like it wasn't like it used to be, but it's going to be better as you learn how to walk with your Lord. And I think that personal encounter leads us out there. We often think of the Father who's the shepherd who leads us by the still waters, but we forget he's also the God who led the Israelites through the desert. But he's still the same one who walks through all of those. And so that personal encounter helps us to have that faith in both seasons of time. And I think that's where Mary met Christ, in that moment where she was in that desert. She found him and he led her beyond those into the pastures beyond. So
That's
good stuff. So if you're looking to have a personal encounter with Jesus in the 21st century, like how does this fit? Like, first, put yourself in a place where you refocus on Jesus. Like that may mean tuning some other things out or finding ways. And again, it's not, I think you should fast until the end of the year. Like, it's not that. It's although that's a valuable part of that, those spiritual disciplines. But it's just an awareness at times and being open to what God is doing. And then that leads to that having that personal encounter. And I like that you don't walk with a dead person, that's really good. And then I think the third thing is we need to let the reality of Jesus' resurrection then motivate us to tell others. I've had multiple history teachers in my life, most of them boring. I can remember my very first class in college was 715 Central Bible College, up in the top of was it Evans Hall was where all the classes were, and this history class was the worst. I mean, I just remember thinking, like it's college life. 7:15 is early after
Tell
being
me it
up
was
too
Old
late.
Testament history and
No, it was
literature, 'cause that's what I had
Western.
at
It was
7:15.
Western Civ, and I couldn't tell you a thing about Western Civilization 1, and there was no way I was signing up for Western Civ 2 because it was painful. But then the next year, I took another history class, totally different teacher who taught American history, and made it come alive. Like it wasn't just some old story and I had to memorize dates. He told the story in a way as if, man, you were there. And it made me want to learn. Well, put your faith in that context too. If Jesus is just names and dates, then nobody's going to want to know. But if he's real inside of you, if the story's transformed you, then you want to tell it. You want to share it. It's what you see Mary does. She lets everybody know, Mark tells us at the end of the gospel. And Book of Acts is like I'm challenged when I read the Book of Acts because it was like a no-brainer. It's not that they had this incredible missionary strategy in Acts 8 when the disciples scattered. They just talked where they went. Like they were telling about it because it was real to them. That's what you see in Paul's life. You see it in ours. And so if Jesus is really alive in our lives, then somehow we're going to share that. People are going to know. They're going to see it, and then they're going to know. There's going to be something that's different in us, and then we're going to want to find a way to say it, not in a creepy way, not in an obnoxious way, not in a I'm better than you kind of way. It should just be a natural part of the story that we tell. And if it's not, then you read instructions, sometimes it's like do step 1, do step 2, do step 3. If step 3 doesn't work, go back to step 1. Like if you're finding in your life right now, you don't really want to talk about Jesus, that not that you don't love him, not that you don't think it's important, it's just not in you, then maybe it's time to go back to the first part and say, how do I refocus on him so I can have that personal experience, and then I'll tell. And I'll say this too, I think it's in Titus, when Titus talks about this, there's a nuance that he gives to the one verse that I can't remember. So when you read through the book of Titus, all 3 chapters of it, like you'll find it there. But it's this concept that the more I tell about him, the more I know him. Mm-hmm. And when I begin to share about Jesus, actually the more I fall in love with Jesus. Yeah. And that's really an important thing. I think that's a relational thing, and would encourage you with that. So,
and I think too that God has placed people in our lives for that very reason. It's no accident that the members of your family are who they are.
Yeah.
It might feel like that sometimes, but it's not. Or the people that you work with, that maybe you hang out with every once in a while, that's not an accident. If you're a Christian, that's not an accident. And so God's wanting to weave your story into their story to help them find his story. And so
did you write that down?
I heard the history part.
That was pretty good.
Yeah, I don't know what I said.
I don't need to weave.
He's wanting to weave your story into their story for his stories, and so I think that's the natural way that you're talking about. It's not like, okay, I have to memorize these 5 scriptures to tell them. It's like, no, they just need to see how your story is different because of his story, and it's going to make a difference in their story.
That's very good.
And so it shouldn't be this weird thing. It actually should be almost like just out of the abundance of who you are.
Yeah, very cool. Well, guys, thanks so much for this time. Thanks for joining us and being a part of this, and honored that you are. Hey, 2 quick things to watch for on our website, and as we talk about this, one, you'll see some dates coming up for an event we call Calvary 101. And if you're new to the church, maybe you haven't had a chance to get involved, get plugged in, know a little bit more about who we are, watch for that. That's coming, I think, the next to the last Thursday in April. And so would love to have you join us for that. Also, if you are maybe new to this walk with Jesus, all of this is kind of new to you, or you go, man, I just feel like there's so much I don't understand. I want to encourage you. We're starting a new group of new kind of core small group process that's called Starting Point. We've got our first group that's meeting right now, and watching what Jesus is doing in their lives is really, really cool to see. It makes me want to jump in, except they meet on Thursday nights when I'm preaching, and so in our Thursday night service. So, but if that is appealing to you, man, go out to our website. If you look at the life groups that are there, you can go ahead and click on that, and there's a new starting point
This Thursday.
starting this Thursday night.
7 o'clock.
So would love for you to be a part. Guys, thanks again. Thanks.